Please be seated. Jesus says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged." But we cannot not judge. I'm not speaking here only or even primarily about courts and courtrooms, but about judgment as a basic human activity, something we all do all the time, long before it ever becomes law. To be human is to discriminate, to name things as better or worse, right or wrong, just or unjust. Judging is surely a human necessity. And when we're told we must not judge, we risk losing something that keeps us from killing each other. You cannot have justice without judgment, and you cannot have judgment without judges. Not only in the formal sense of the courtroom, you'll be glad to hear, especially their honours, but in the ordinary business of human life. Judgment happens wherever decisions are made, in families and friendships, in schools and workplaces, in churches and in communities. There needs to be a business of judging done by people who judge, by the courts certainly, but in many other spheres, from grading university papers to selecting a sports team. The law represents one vital and highly disciplined expression of this wider human activity, but it is not its origin. Long before judgment is institutional, it is human. But in our present cultural moment, judgment has acquired a deeply negative resonance. In ordinary usage, to judge is often taken to mean to condemn, to impose one's views on another without due process, without proportionality, and without self-scrutiny. Judgment is therefore associated not with justice, but with bias, exclusion, and the abuse of power. What is frequently missed is the distinction between judgment and prejudice. Judgment, properly understood, is not the arbitrary assertion of personal preference, but the disciplined practice of discrimination, weighing evidence, naming wrongdoing, and rendering decisions that are accountable to standards beyond the self. Prejudice, by contrast, bypasses such standards altogether. Now, contemporary anxieties about judgment are not groundless. Judgment is necessarily asymmetrical. One party stands in a position of authority over another. But in a world rightly alert to the misuse of power, this asymmetry can appear suspect. And here, a fierce moral and spiritual question presses itself home. How is it that one human being can judge another, given that human is a byword for flawed? Is it possible to judge without prejudice? How can we stand over others when we only ever stand side by side with them? Is it not only that as human beings we know imperfectly, it is not only that as human beings we know imperfectly and also come to the world with our biases and preferences, it is also that our knowledge is distorted by what in theological language we call sin. We have to evaluate the moral failures of others as those who likewise fail. Even our best work is done under the shadow of error. As James Madison observed with characteristic sobriety, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Now, we might expect more help from Jesus, but he says, "Do not judge, so that you may not be judged." We judge. He says, "Do not judge." But what is Jesus actually saying? Is he really warning us against any human decision that might privilege one way of looking at the world over another, or one way of behaving over another? Certainly, the Bible tells us, as we've read already, that the people of Israel were given authority to judge civil disputes and even the office of judge. And it was the neglect of judging that was held against them in the prophets. Jeremiah 5 provides one example of many. No judging means no justice on the Bible's own terms. And when there is no justice, it is the poor and vulnerable who suffer most. But Jesus says, do not judge. What can he be saying? Now we get some help from the verses that follow about the log and the speck, or as the Authorized Version used to put it, the mote and the beam. The one who judges without making themselves the first subject of judgment cuts an absurd figure, outraged at the misdemeanor in the other, yet failing to see their own major crimes. These logs in our eyes cause us to be blind. And yet the final consequence of this sort of judging is clear. Do not judge, says Jesus, so that you may not be judged. Condemnation of others is ultimately the reason for one's own condemnation. It is this judging that brings down the judgment of God, for it takes the place of the judgment that belongs only to God. As Jesus goes on, for with the judgment you make, you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. We might be tempted to admire the view from the high moral ground, but we too are answerable. Even as we do have to make judgments, we do so not as those who stand outside of judgment ourselves, which is the point. Judging of all kinds begins with the God who has delegated judgment temporarily to us. We do it imperfectly, but necessarily. When we judge in anticipation of God's final and perfect judgment, and recognize that we are to answer for our judgments. Human judging ought to begin with a judging of the self, attending to the speck, or perhaps the log, in my own eye. Few works in the English tradition have explored this more searchingly than Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, a play that's obsessed with law, judgment, authority, hypocrisy, and finally mercy. It takes its title and its theme from Jesus' words in the very passage we heard today. The play turns on the figure of Angelo, a rigorously upright judge, appointed to enforce the law with unbending severity. His fault is not that he judges, but that he judges without self-knowledge. He applies the law strictly to others, while remaining blind to the disorder of his own heart. And so Shakespeare exposes what happens when judgment is exercised without inward scrutiny. At the centre of the play stands a line that deliberately echoes the teachings of Jesus. As the godlike figure of the Duke observes, haste still pays haste, and leisure answers leisure. Like doth quit like, and measure still for measure. The judgment one gives becomes the judgment one receives. The standard applied to another becomes the standard by which the judge himself is weighed. Nowhere is this more clearly expressed than in the plea made by Isabella in the play to Angelo when she asks him to pause before condemning her brother Claudio to death. She says, "Go to your bosom, knock there, and ask your heart what it doth know that's like my brother's fault." It's Shakespeare's version of the log and the speck. Before the sentence is pronounced, the judge is summoned to the bar of his own conscience. The problem is not the existence of law, nor even the necessity of judgment, but the failure of the judge to remember that he too stands under judgment. Our judgment is subject to judgment. This principle is foundational to our legal and political system. But it is so because, in the first instance, it is an existential and spiritual truth with which we have to reckon, unencumbered by our status and accomplishments as mere human beings. We inhabit a morally consequential universe in which good and evil are not illusions. We are called to look up beyond ourselves for what judgment truly is, to the divine judge who made all things. But what we find there is unexpected. Divine judgment is not, it turns out, marked by severity, but by mercy. Not karma, where, to quote those great Australian philosophers, Savage Garden, what you give is what you get returned, but the sweet sound of grace. As the hymn says, there's a wideness in God's mercy, like the wideness of the sea. The divine judgment appears not in a courtroom, but on a cross. Ironically, from the human side, a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. But at the cross, we stand in the presence of true judgment. We see what kind of judge God is. Evil is not excused or minimized. It is judged in truth, but it is judged by God, upon God. Jesus Christ, as the Swiss theologian Karl Barth used to say, is the judge judged. The cross is not the cancellation of judgment, but the moment when judgment becomes grace. Measure is given for measure, but it is paid out in mercy. And this is why mercy is not the enemy of justice, but its fulfillment. At the cross, justice is not abandoned, it is satisfied. God's mercy is not leniency, it is a judgment born and exhausted. The law is not mocked, it is honoured, even as it is surpassed. To turn to another of Shakespeare's plays, earthly power doth then show likest gods when mercy seasons justice. So when Jesus says, do not judge so that you will not be judged, he is not calling us to abdicate responsibility. He is calling us to remember where we stand under a judge who is both righteous and merciful. To judge, for judge we must, in life as well as in the law. From the foot of the cross is to exercise power with humility, to name wrongdoing without self-righteousness, and to remember that our every human judgment stands before a higher court. Amen.